The rise of Herod the Great to the rule of Judea and surrounding territories is intimately tied with the story of the fall of the Hasmonean dynasty. In particular, it is tied to the intervention of Rome in Judean affairs. At the end of the Hasmonean dynasty, Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II, two brothers, both descendants of Simon, the last surviving brother of Judas Maccabeus, the hero of the Maccabean revolt, were involved in a small-scale civil war against one another. They appealed to their ally to the west, to Rome, to intervene and to settle their quarrel. They did not cooperate, at least Aristobulus and his party did not cooperate to the extent that pleased Pompey, with the result that Pompey invaded Judea and lay siege to Jerusalem, was admitted into Jerusalem by Hyrcanus's supporters, besieged the temple, and finally took the temple and drove out Aristobulus's supporters while taking Aristobulus and his family back to Rome as prisoners. This is a very important series of events not only because it brought to an end the Hasmonean dynasty, which had given Israel a taste of political independence again for a span of about 80 years after 4 centuries or more of Gentile domination, but because it also introduced Rome to the population of Judea in a very particular way, a way that was not altogether flattering or conducive to long-term good relations. As we think about the rise of Herod, it's appropriate also to think about how some Jews, at least, were reflecting upon the fall of the Hasmonean dynasty and the intervention of Rome. One series of texts, one collection of texts that derives from this period and reflects explicitly on this period is the Psalms of Solomon, obviously not written by Solomon, attributed to him in later traditions about the transmission of the text, but more than likely written by pious Jews living in the period of 67 to 48 BC, first-hand witnesses to these events. And what these psalms show is, on the one hand, a rejection of the last Hasmonean kings and high priests, holding them to be sinful, while at the same time not endorsing the actions of Pompey or the Roman forces that intervened, and, one might surmise, not endorsing the arrangements that Pompey left in place. So in these Psalms, we have the authors reflecting on how God has exposed the sins of the rulers, the Hasmonean kings and high priests, and the sins of other leaders in Jerusalem, by bringing Pompey, described as a man from the end of the earth who strikes mightily, a man that is foreign to our race. The Roman general Pompey came ready to wage war, and thus, according to Psalms of Solomon 8, the rulers of the land went to meet him with joy. They said to him, "Welcome is your journey. Come, enter in with peace." They leveled out the rough ways before his entering in. They opened the gates to Jerusalem. They crowned its walls. He entered as a father enters his son's house in peace. He set down his feet with great assurance. He took possession of her fortified towers and of the wall of Jerusalem. This speaks of Hyrcanus's supporters opening the gates of Jerusalem to Pompey and his army, and his initial steps into the city. But of course the supporters of Aristobulus resisted, and they fortified themselves within the Temple Mount itself, and thus according to Psalms of Solomon 2, the sinner became proud and cast down fortified walls with a battering ram. And you, addressing God, you did not restrain him. Foreign nations went up to your altar. They arrogantly trampled it with their sandals, because the sons of Jerusalem had defiled the sanctuary of the Lord and polluted their offerings to God with lawless deeds. Here the writer remembers Pompey's entrance into the temple courts, into the holy place, even into the Holy of Holies itself, where he did not plunder or commit any further sacrilege than entering. Indeed, he authorized the priests immediately following to make the necessary sacrifices for the purification of the sanctuary and resumption of its sacrifices. Nevertheless, the author of the psalm looks back upon that event as proof of God's displeasure with the preceding administration of the temple. Because they had been sinners, God allowed this encroachment upon his sanctuary. Nevertheless, a Jewish author does not excuse Pompey, even if he was God's tool for vengeance or for punishment upon the sinners within Jerusalem, because according to him, Pompey was not seeking to serve God. He was simply also showing a sinful neglect of God's holy place, and thus God must punish him as well. And so we read further in Psalms of Solomon 2, "It was not out of zeal that they acted, but in lust of soul, so as to pour out their wrath upon us in plunder. Delay not, O God, to bring recompense upon their heads. And I did not wait long before God showed me his body, stabbed on the mountains of Egypt, esteemed of less account than the least on land and sea, his body carried about on the waves in great ignominy, with none to bury him, because God had rejected him in dishonor." This author is writing after 48 BC, when indeed Pompey the Great was assassinated in Egypt by a ruler there wishing to curry favor with Julius Caesar, Sextus Pompeius's rival. But this was the introduction of Roman rule into Judea. An intervention in Judean affairs, a displacement of a native dynasty, an invasion of the holiest place within the temple itself, and thus a signal to all of Israel, again, of what it would mean to live under the heel of Gentile rulers. But as the Hasmoneans fell, Herod began to rise. Herod, and first Herod's father, Antipater, who had been the governor of Idumea under the last Hasmoneans, and had in fact been pushing Hyrcanus II to continue to compete with his brother Aristobulus II for the titles of king and high priest, goading him on in this civil war. And after Pompey's intervention, Aristobulus and his own sons did not cease to fight to regain power, to regain the throne. While Aristobulus and his sons were being taken to Rome to be held captive, one escaped on the way, and then finally Aristobulus and his other son escaped from captivity in Rome. So first, the son Alexander led an uprising in 57 BC, trying to regain the throne for his side of the family. The following year, 56 BC, Aristobulus and his other son, Mattathias Antigonus, led an uprising, trying to regain the throne. Alexander led a second uprising the year following that. At this point, decisive actions were taken, resulting in the poisoning of Aristobulus, the capture and beheading of Alexander at Pompey's order. At this point, we get to the death of Pompey the Great. That was remembered in Psalms of Solomon too. At this time, a civil war had been breaking out amongst the Romans. Julius Caesar, Sextus Pompeius, and Marcus Licinius Crassus, first a triumvirate sharing rule of the empire, quickly degenerating into rivals for sole rule of the empire. Antipater and his son Herod, actually his whole family, had cast in their lot with Julius Caesar, although they had formerly benefited from Pompey's friendship and interventions in Judea. As a result, with Caesar's ascendancy, Antipater became the procurator of Judea alongside Hyrcanus II, who continued in the more modest role of high priest. And Herod, together with his brother Phasael, became governors of Galilee and Jerusalem, respectively. So Herod began to become a very prominent figure in this territory. As Hasmonean strife continued, one of Hyrcanus's supporters was able to isolate and kill Antipater in 43 BC. Shortly thereafter, the surviving son of Aristobulus, Mattathias Antigonus, led another uprising in Galilee. And this was going to gather significant momentum. Herod tried to secure his own position by joining himself to the Hasmonean house. He sought and won a betrothal to Mariamne, who was a granddaughter of Hyrcanus II, and thus potentially uniting himself with this family and perhaps advancing or securing his position thereby. At this point, we also have to remember that Rome continues to be in turmoil. Julius Caesar was assassinated in 44 BC. And his assassins, Brutus and Cassius, left with their armies for the Eastern Empire. They would eventually be killed by Mark Antony and Octavian, acting together. And Herod managed to survive the territory's change of hands, first from Pompey to Caesar to Cassius, and finally now to Mark Antony, showing his prowess as a political survivor and player. After the death of Caesar and the punishment of the assassins, Brutus, Cassius, their co-conspirators, and their forces, a second triumvirate was formed. Mark Antony, Caesar, Octavian having been adopted by Julius Caesar while an adult, but thus designating Octavian as Caesar's heir. And a third character about which we tend to think little, Marcus Lepidus, who was smart and retired from the triumvirate before the next civil war would break out. Against this backdrop, Mattathias Antigonus sought the support of the enemies of Rome to the east, the Parthian Empire, and with their backing he was able to seize control of Judea, and in effect set himself up as king, as his father and Aristobulus II had briefly been, and certainly as his grandfather and great-grandfather had enjoyed previously. At this point, Herod fled Judea along with his family, and Phasael committed suicide to avoid capture and disgrace. Mattathias captured his own uncle, Hyrcanus II, and had his ears cut off, so that Hyrcanus, being now not whole, would no longer be qualified to hold the office of high priest, and so would no longer be a threat to Mattathias's hold over the country. Herod fled to Rome. He had left his family, actually, with a sizable number of soldiers for protection at Masada, which had been a fortress that the Hasmoneans had built and fortified in the late 2nd century BC. So they were well provisioned and quite safe there for the time it took Herod to go to Rome, where, as a good Roman ally, he was in fact proclaimed king and returned with Roman support, Roman armies, to take the throne for himself away from Mattathias, who had clearly shown himself to be an enemy of Rome because he had partnered so obviously with Rome's enemy, the Parthians to the east. After years of struggle, by 37 BC, Herod was in fact able to defeat Mattathias and drive his supporters out of Judea and secure his throne, at which point, still under the patronage of Mark Antony, who was still in power and in favor, Herod married Mariamne and thus joined himself to the Hasmonean line that he had now effectively replaced. Civil war broke out between Octavian and Antony. Antony, who was famously allied with Cleopatra VII in Egypt. And Antony, of course, with Cleopatra, was defeated by Octavian's forces. And Herod was able to survive yet another transition in Roman power. After Antony's defeat, Herod brought himself before Octavian, and his speech is remembered to the effect of saying, mighty Octavian, don't consider whose friend I've been, but what kind of friend I've been. The implication being Herod had simply been a loyal client of the representative of Rome in power in the East, and would continue to be as loyal a client of the new representative of Roman power, not only in the East but worldwide, namely Octavian himself. Should pause here just briefly to think about Rome's emergence as an empire. It had been an empire for centuries by this point, even while it was a republic in terms of its internal governance. It held territories far outside of Italy. For example, North Africa, Western Asia Minor, parts of southern Gaul, and the like. But of course, it grew, its imperialism expanded, eventually to include the entire circle of lands around the Mediterranean. It reorganized itself internally with the rise of Octavian, so that while republican titles tended to be preserved, one man would continue to hold many of those titles year after year. And that man, of course, was Octavian, who came to be named Augustus, a revered figure. Rome would care after the administration of the provinces directly. It would either send senators to govern certain provinces, the more troubled provinces where legions tended to have to be kept were imperial provinces which would not be administered by a senator, a proconsul, but rather by an imperial delegate, usually from the second tier of citizens, not the senators, but the equestrians, the knights, who would administer the provinces on the emperor's behalf and as people answerable to the emperor, and not likely to try to start their own empire with the province under their control. Rome is not remembered well by most Jewish authors of the period, I think one might have to say. Writers like John, who left us Revelation, or the authors of 4th Ezra and 2nd Baruch, look back upon Rome's history in the Eastern Mediterranean, and especially in the land of Israel, as a history of violent conquest, of ongoing repression, of economic exploitation, and especially of blasphemous arrogance, this last charge being related chiefly to the ways in which Rome presented itself and its leaders throughout the Mediterranean, and all the more throughout the Eastern Mediterranean, in the cult of the goddess Roma Aeterna, eternal Rome, and the cult of the emperors, as well as the related myths of Rome's divine destiny. The city of Rome was personified as a woman, as most cities and provinces were in the time. But this wasn't just a personification, this was a deification. Roma became a goddess who was worshipped in temples across the Mediterranean. And with Roma was worshipped the divine Augustus. Even during his lifetime in the East, which had a habit of worshipping or offering cult to its living rulers and not simply deceased, divinized rulers. This is something that one can see throughout the Principate. In these coins we see Augustus Caesar on the front and the deified Julius commemorated on the back. This is his adoptive father, Julius Caesar. The figure here is that of the comet that was said to be seen when Julius died, the comet that signaled his soul ascending to the realm of the divine. After Augustus's own death, he was divinized, made a god by the Senate. Hence this coin now doesn't just read Augustus, but Divus Augustus, the divine or the divinized Augustus. And pater here is short for pater patriae, the father of the fatherland. On this coin of Claudius, we see on the reverse the facade of the temple built to the god Augustus and the goddess Rome in Pergamum, a major city of the province of Asia Minor. In this coin we see, after Vespasian's death, the commemoration of his divination by the Senate, as he is now, after his death, Divus Augustus Vespasianus, the divine Augustus Vespasian. There was, however, a bright side to Roman imperialism as well. One is tempted to cut here to a famous scene from Monty Python's Life of Brian. But Rome did construct an amazing road system that facilitated travel across the empire. Of course, its purposes were to enable its legions to move with efficiency and speed from one place to another, to maintain order or to push the frontiers. Nevertheless, it also became the means for vastly improved travel and trade throughout the empire. Rome is justly celebrated for its improvements in the water supply to cities wherever it went. Aqueducts still stand across the Mediterranean as a testimony to Roman engineering in this regard, as well as to Rome's commitment to provide drinkable water and public baths and even latrines in all the major cities. It is frequently said that Europe would not enjoy the level of hygiene and sanitation again that it enjoyed under the Roman emperors until the Renaissance period. Rome policed the land and policed the seas, fighting brigands and piracy, making travel and trade much safer. And of course, if your city or your province experienced a devastating famine or a blight on the crops or what have you, the emperor could be petitioned and would often seek to supply the aid that would get your city or your population through that bad year. It was a tremendous safety net also for the provinces. As we return our thinking to Herod and his kingdom, we have to admire the ingenuity of a man who, though born of common stock by all accounts, nevertheless managed to be appointed king of a kingdom that gradually increased throughout Augustus's reign, as Herod proved himself competent, loyal, grateful, someone upon whom Augustus could rely in that region. And thus his kingdom spread from just Judea and Samaria to include areas on the far side of the Jordan, areas throughout Galilee, areas through the north, the regions known as Gaulonitis, Auronitis, Trachonitis, up into the area of Iturea. The one big gap in this kingdom was the region of the Decapolis, which was a loose federation, not federation in any real sense, but a loose collection of 10 Greek cities and their hinterlands, the territories controlled by each of these Gentile cities in this region. Herod is remembered for many things, but probably for nothing more commonly than his magnificent renovation and expansion project of the temple in Jerusalem. This was truly a marvel, a vision in the first instance, and also of engineering to bring this vision into reality. Herod began by rebuilding the temple, the sanctuary itself, the holy place, and the area around the Holy of Holies. And, to his credit, respecting the scruples of the Jewish people, of which he was sort of one. That's a whole other question. How Jewish was Herod? Was he half Jewish by a Jewish mother and an Idumean father? A question still not entirely solved. Nevertheless, out of respect for the concern of his subjects and the priestly class for this building, he actually trained members of the priestly class, or had trained members of the priestly class, to do the actual construction work under the supervision of foremen and master builders of the new holy place, and probably just building around the earlier Holy of Holies. He also built new courtyards for the court of Israel and the court of women, and probably most magnificently, he expanded the court of the nations, the court open to all nations, this vast internal area. He did this by expanding the temple platform itself, both to the south, this area here, and to the north, perhaps from about here to the end. And he also expanded it in the westward direction. He could not expand it to the east because of the slope going into the Kidron Valley. And this was a remarkable feat of engineering. One can actually still see here on the southern part of the eastern wall the joint that marks the end of the temple platform as it existed prior to Herod, and the part that Herod added. It's this straight joint here, visible here on an angle, this straight joint here, about 110 feet away from the new edge. So he added that whole segment on the south, and almost a similar segment on the north side of this. And he did this not filling this all with rubble, thus putting incredible pressure on the walls, but he did it building arched barrel vaults underneath. This is actually an old photo from the 19th century of what is erroneously called Solomon's stables, but really vast storerooms under the Temple Mount that also support over this barreled vault the new platform of the court of the Gentiles. Herod decorated the sides of the temple. It wasn't just a straight brick face, but it had a kind of a projected pilaster design, something that one can see here on the inside of the temple of Zeus in Gerasa, for example. Something one can also see on the still standing Herodian construction built around the tomb of the patriarchs, the tombs of Abraham and Sarah in Hebron in Israel, south of Jerusalem. This pilaster design where kind of columns stand out from the wall itself but aren't actually separate buildings give a very pleasing architectural look to the whole. Of course, Herod also built the magnificent portico on the southern side of this new enclosure, and entirely new approaches from the south and from the west and from the north, including the fortress Antonia, which is where Roman cohorts would keep order in Jerusalem. Herod's building projects spanned all of Israel. In fact, they burst the boundaries of Israel. He is known for lavish benefactions given to foreign cities, even Athens, Rhodes, and Berytus, which is modern Beirut in Lebanon, benefited from Herod's benefactions. He paid for the erection of buildings in all of these cities. But within Israel itself, he built some marvelous cities. For example, Caesarea by the Sea was another example of Herod conquering nature with his vision and with the vast resources he was able to throw behind his projects. Caesarea by the Sea became a marvelous port city, the only port like it on the coast of Israel, and the port of choice between Alexandria, Egypt, and Tyre to the north in modern Lebanon. So by building this harbor, Herod staked a claim in the Mediterranean sea trade for his kingdom. And the harbor was a marvelous feat of engineering. He created breakwaters along both sides of the harbor, and what we see here is actually just the inner harbor. There was a much larger set of breakwaters beyond these, creating an outer harbor. So it took a coast that was pummeled by the Mediterranean surf and created a very peaceful, very safe anchorage for hundreds of merchant ships and other traveling vessels. At the point of entry from the harbor into the city, Herod constructed another temple, this time not to the God of Israel, but to the god Augustus and to the goddess Roma, in keeping with the practice of Gentile cities, cities meant to be multi-national, multicultural cities throughout the empire. Now, almost nothing remains of the temple of Rome and Augustus in Caesarea today, merely its foundations. But at one point, it probably looked like one of these four-pillared marvels, like this one that's almost perfectly intact, still standing in Croatia today. Herod, because he took an old Hellenistic city, Strato's Tower, and made a much larger city out of it, Caesarea by the Sea, increased its water supply with the famous aqueduct. Actually, this is a double aqueduct. One comes from the Herodian period. The second, that doubled the potential water supply, was actually not built until Hadrian's reign, after 130 AD, after the suppression of the Bar Kokhba rebellion, to which we will come in good time. Caesarea by the Sea also had an expansive theater. It had a hippodrome, a place for chariot races. It had a marvelous palace built out onto a promontory of the sea, located in this area here, south of the harbor, where Herod himself would stay, and later procurators and prefects sent by Rome would make their home. Herod similarly built up the city of Samaria, renaming it Sebaste. Just like Caesarea by the Sea is obviously named to honor Caesar, Sebaste is named to honor Augustus. Augustus is a Latin title. In Greek, it's Sebastos. So a city named Sebaste is clearly linked with him. And of course, this city, under Herod's direction, received a theater, received other accoutrements of a typical Greek city there in the heart of the region of Samaria. And it also received its own temple to Rome and Augustus, just as Caesarea by the Sea had done. Again, very little of this remains. In fact, the stairway that remains is a 2nd or 3rd century expansion to Herod's original temple. Herod built a third such temple to Augustus and Roma in the area of what would become known as Caesarea Philippi. Caesarea in the north, about an hour's drive north of the Sea of Galilee, what was in a city known as Paneas in the late Hellenistic, early Roman period. It's likely that the temple itself was built about 3 or 4 miles south of Paneas or Caesarea Philippi, alongside a major road leading up from Galilee out toward Damascus. So Herod's two personae show themselves very clearly in his building. He benefits Judeans in a manner befitting Judeans, making of their temple to the one God one of the wonders of the ancient world. But then he also builds Greek cities throughout the land of Israel, but outside of Judea, in which he plants temples to other gods, especially to his deified patron Augustus. Herod is also known for the building of palaces and fortresses throughout the land of Israel. Probably the most famous of these fortresses is Masada, which was the site of kind of the last holdout during the first Jewish revolt of 66 to 73 AD, to which, again, we will come in due course. Masada, once again, was originally fortified by the Hasmoneans, perhaps under Alexander Jannaeus in the early 2nd century BC, as part of a string of fortresses along the east and southern boundaries of Israel, providing some watchful defenses against the Arabian and Nabatean peoples to the east and the south. Herod overbuilt the Hasmonean fortifications and added another architectural splendor, at least in its time it would have been. On its northernmost cliffs, Herod had built a three-tiered palace for himself and for his guests. A marvel of engineering. It's about 90 steps from the top layer, where the bulk of Herod's own palace was, down to a second tier where there was a circular reception hall, down to a third tier where there was a rectangular triclinium or dining hall, reception hall, where he might entertain his guests lavishly, here in the middle of the most arid desert. It was fabulously well supplied with water, to such an extent that Herod was able to have a large swimming pool on the top of Masada, as well as several Roman-style bath complexes around the top. Herod also found a mound about 12 miles south of Jerusalem, southeast of Jerusalem. And he had that mound artificially built up, and within that mound he built a fortress/palace. Originally, this would have stood about 3 large stories out of the top of the mound, with 4 towers, one on each side, high fortification walls all around, but inside all the luxuries of a royal palace. Down a flight of steps that goes all the way down, straight down to the bottom of the mound, Herod built and you can actually see the steps must be on this side, you can see the remains up here, built a much larger palace at ground level. The remains of the palace can be seen here, and off to the side, the remains of a colonnade encircled pool. And this pool was of immense dimensions, such that there was an island in the middle with gardens and kind of a place for relaxation and enjoyment in the midst of this, again creating a fabulous pleasure site at the foot of this fortified hill. Herod also built palaces for himself outside of the city of Jericho, right next to the site that the Hasmoneans had chosen to build their winter palaces in. In fact, eventually Herod built over the foundations of the Hasmonean palaces, extending his own villa over them, perhaps savoring the irony himself, that just as he supplanted that line, so he supplanted their domiciles throughout Israel. Another of Herod's great achievements has to do with the water supply of all of his new constructions. Here I focus simply on his increase of the water supply for Jerusalem, which grew, the city which grew tremendously during his reign. He increased the number of reservoirs, known erroneously as Solomon's pools. These are just maybe 2 miles away from Bethlehem, to the south, about 6-7 miles south of, that's probably wrong, about 12 miles south of Jerusalem. One of these reservoirs dates from the Hasmonean period, but Herod expanded them, increased the aqueduct supply to them, so that more water would be available for Jerusalem. He also built large reservoirs right outside of the city of Jerusalem, such as this pool, the Mamilla, so-called Mamilla Pool, a large reservoir just outside the northwest corner of the present walls of the city of Jerusalem. So Herod certainly left his mark architecturally across Israel, and to a great extent, to give credit where credit is due, improved vastly the quality of life of many residents of his kingdom. At the same time, Herod had some serious issues. It does appear that Herod's paranoia and insecurity only increased with his age, and perhaps he really became mentally unstable in the process as well. We certainly can't say that he was mad all of his life, because he was actually a shrewd politician, an excellent politician for most of his life. But toward the end, things got quite crazy in the house of Herod. Now, Herod had a series of marriages, all of which produced offspring. But we concern ourselves first with his earlier marriages and the offspring of those marriages, notably his marriage to the Hasmonean princess Mariamne, who gave birth to Alexander and Aristobulus. Aristobulus was able to marry and have children of his own. But tension between Herod and the Hasmoneans never really ceased, never went away. Even when the Hasmoneans were his in-laws, they remained to some extent his rivals, and he theirs. He remained an outsider to them. And so as his reign went on and his paranoia became probably diagnosable as some sort of disorder, he had his wife Mariamne executed, as well as his 2 sons by her, thus finally removing the real or imagined Hasmonean threat to his rule. Earlier in his reign, he had another Hasmonean heir drowned in the pool of the Hasmonean palace in Jericho. Herod had also had a son by a woman named Doris, this son Antipater, named after his own father. Just 5 days before Herod's own death, he had Antipater executed under suspicion of fomenting treason. Herod himself finally died about the age of 70, and by his own order, according to his wishes, he was buried in Herodion, in that palace that he had built on the artificial mound southeast of Jerusalem. Just somewhat recently, Ehud Netzer discovered what he believes to be the mausoleum of Herod, about halfway down the mound of Herodion. Within this monument, which was completely destroyed, were found pieces of this ornate sarcophagus now in the Israel Museum, believed once to have held the body of Herod the Great. Ehud Netzer also found pieces that would have decorated the top of this, what would have been a 3-story mausoleum in its day. And with Herod dead, it then came to the point of deciding how his kingdom would be divided, how the Roman governance of the land of Israel would continue. That will be the topic of part 2 of this presentation, From Herod to Hadrian.